Edith Piaf and Marlene Dietrich had performed on the same stages, moved through the same cities, and understood, without ever saying it directly, exactly what the other was carrying. The night Dietrich walked into her dressing room, something changed between them. This is not a story about rivalry. It is not a story about competition, or about two famous women measuring themselves against each other in the way that the press of that era often wanted famous women to be measured. It is a story about recognition, the particular kind that only moves between people who have lived inside the same specific pressures and who understand, without needing it explained, the cost of what the other has chosen to do with their life. To understand what that recognition meant and why the night it became visible mattered as much as it did, you have to understand who each of these women was in Paris in the late 1940s, and how different their roots to that city had been. Marlene Dietrich had come to Paris from a different direction than Piaf in almost every sense. She had been born in Berlin, had built her early career in German cabaret and German cinema, and had moved to Hollywood in the early 1930s when Josef von Sternberg cast her in a series of films that made her face and her voice recognizable across the world in a way that very few performers ever achieved. By the time she was moving through Paris in the late 1940s, her name carried a weight that had nothing to do with any single performance or any single city. She had become, over the course of 2 decades, something larger than a career, a presence, a silhouette, a quality of self-possession so complete that it had become its own kind of art form. She was, in the specific vocabulary of that era, a star, not in the casual modern sense, but in the older, more demanding sense that required a person to embody something beyond their individual talent. Edith Piaf had arrived at a similar level of recognition through an entirely different path. Not through Hollywood, not through cinema, not through the glamour machinery that had shaped Dietrich's public image. She had come up from the streets of Paris, from the courtyards and the small clubs, carrying a voice that did not accommodate itself to anything, and a presence on stage that operated by a completely different set of rules than the composed, sculptural quality Dietrich projected. Where Dietrich was stillness and control, Piaf was movement and exposure. Where Dietrich gave audiences a surface so perfectly constructed that it became its own kind of mystery, Piaf gave audiences the inside of something, a rawness that most performers would have considered dangerous, and that she had, over years of stages, learned to make into her strongest quality. These were not similar women. They were not similar performers. The things each of them did on a stage were almost opposite in their methods, and the worlds each had come from could hardly have been further apart. And yet, in the late 1940s, in Paris, they occupied a similar position in the landscape of European entertainment. 2 women who had achieved something that the men around them had not, which was the specific authority that comes from an audience that does not simply admire what you do, but feels changed by having been present when you did it. Paris itself had a specific relationship with each of them that was not quite like the relationship any other city had. For Piaf, Paris was not simply a city where she performed. It was the city she had come from, the city whose streets had taught her the only education she ever received, and the city whose audiences carried a knowledge of her that went back further than any review or recording. They had heard her before she was famous, some of them, in the years when she was one unnamed voice among the many that moved through the clubs and cabarets of Pigalle and Belleville. For Dietrich, Paris was something different, a city she had chosen, repeatedly, as the place where the particular version of herself she had constructed could be received with the seriousness it deserved. France, and Paris specifically, had understood Dietrich in ways that other cities sometimes failed to, had accorded her an artistic credibility that sat alongside her fame rather than being consumed by it. Both women, arriving in Paris from opposite ends of the world, had found in it something the world outside it could not quite offer them. This was not a small thing to have in common. They had crossed paths before this night. The world of Paris entertainment in this era was not a large world. The same venues, the same hotels, the same circuit of parties and after-show gatherings moved through by the same rotating cast of people, and two performers of their visibility could not inhabit the same city for long without being aware of each other. But awareness is not the same as encounter, and the specific encounter this story is about had not happened before in quite this form. On this particular evening, both women were connected to performances in the same part of Paris, Piaf finishing a concert run at one of the city's established venues, Dietrich present in the city for reasons connected to her own work, the precise details of which vary depending on the account. The building, the timing, the particular configuration of that night placed them in proximity in a way that required something to happen or nothing to happen, and the decision about which of those it would be belonged, as it turned out, to Dietrich. She went to Piaf's dressing room. The people who were in the building that evening, the musicians, the stagehands, the small retinue of people who moved through the back corridors of concert venues after a performance, registered this in the way that people register things that are both surprising and somehow completely inevitable. Dietrich did not ask anyone to announce her. She did not send a message ahead. She simply moved through the corridor that led to Piaf's dressing room and opened the door. Piaf was still in the immediate aftermath of the concert, the particular state that follows a performance that has gone fully, which is a state of simultaneous exhaustion and heightened awareness, the body still running at a pitch that the stage demands and that takes time to come down from. She was not expecting anyone. The dressing room contained the ordinary debris of an evening's work, the mirror still lit, the traces of preparation not yet fully cleared away, the particular atmosphere of a room that belongs to a performer in the hour between a performance and the world outside it. Dietrich walked in, and the room became something other than what it had been. What passed between them in the time that followed is the part of the story that no record has fully preserved, for the simple reason that neither of them preserved it. The accounts that exist, and they exist in fragmentary forms, in the recollections of people who were nearby, in the occasional oblique references that each woman made in separate interviews over the years, agree on the quality of what happened more than on the content. What they describe is not a dramatic scene. There was no argument, no declaration, no moment that could be pointed to and labeled. There were two women in a room, speaking with the particular directness that people sometimes achieve when they are too tired to be careful and too experienced to need to be. Dietrich said something to Piaf about the performance she had just given. Not a compliment in the ordinary sense, not the kind of praise that passes between people who are being polite or strategic, but something more specific and more difficult to offer, which is the recognition of one professional by another who has earned the right to judge. The specific words have not survived in any reliable form. What survived is the account of how Piaf received them, not with the deflection that performers often use when they are complimented, the half-dismissal that keeps the other person at a manageable distance, but with a stillness that the people who knew her described as unusual. She was not a still person. She was, by most accounts, someone in continuous motion, even in the moments between performing, and the quality of attention she gave Dietrich in those minutes was described by one person who saw the beginning of the encounter as unlike anything they had seen her give in a dressing room before. Piaf said something in return. Again, the specific content has not survived in any form that can be called reliable. What the accounts describe is an exchange, not a one-sided delivery of praise, but a genuine conversation, two people speaking directly to each other about something that had no performance in it, no calculation about how it would be received. They spoke for perhaps half an hour, perhaps less. The accounts differ on the duration in the way that accounts of significant conversations always differ, because duration is one of the things that memory distorts most consistently. What all the accounts agree on is that when Dietrich left, the people in the corridor noticed something about how she moved that was different from how she had moved when she arrived. Not visibly, not in any way that could be pointed to and described precisely, but in the particular way that a person moves when they have just put something down that they have been carrying for a long time. Piaf, by all accounts that exist, did not speak about the visit that evening to anyone who was still with her in the room. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet after something has landed, and the people who were there had the collective good sense not to ask. This kind of silence was not characteristic of her. She was not, by nature or by habit, a person who held things at a distance. Her performances made that clear, and her life offstage was in many ways an extension of the same quality of openness, the same willingness to let what she was feeling be visible to the people around her. The silence that followed Dietrich's visit was, for the people who knew her well enough to notice, a specific kind of silence. Not emptiness, but fullness of a kind that had not yet found its form in words. She sat with it, and no one interrupted it. And by the time the evening moved on into the ordinary logistics of closing a venue and moving people out into the Paris night, the moment had passed into the category of things that happened and were not explained. In the months and years that followed, both women spoke occasionally about each other, in interviews, in the memoirs that each eventually produced in one form or another, in the offhand comments that performers make about their contemporaries in conversation. What neither of them ever produced was a direct account of that night, or of what had been said in that room. This was not, in either case, the result of hostility or of any desire to conceal. It was something simpler and, in its own way, more revealing. Some things that happen between people resist being put into language. Not because the language doesn't exist, but because the putting into language would make it smaller than it was. What the night left behind, not in any record but in the way each of them moved through the world afterward, was a particular kind of awareness. Not friendship exactly, though the word is sometimes used in the accounts that lean toward the generous. Something more precise than friendship, and less easy to name. The specific quality of having been seen accurately by someone who had the credentials to see you, and of having offered the same thing in return. Two women who had each, in their own way and by their own means, earned the right to be standing in Paris at the height of their careers, recognizing in each other the thing that the audiences and the press and the biographers would spend decades trying to describe and never quite reaching. Edith Piaf went on to the years that followed that night, carrying what she always carried, the weight and the heat of the work, the particular life she had built on stages across France and beyond. Marlene Dietrich continued moving through the world in her own way, at her own altitude, by her own rules. Their paths crossed again in the years after, in the specific way that the paths of people at that level cross, publicly, briefly, with the surface politeness of two people who have chosen not to make their private understanding into a public event. The dressing room in Paris is gone now, as most of those rooms are gone, the building reconfigured or demolished, the corridor that Dietrich walked down no longer the same corridor, the mirror that Piaf sat in front of that evening long since moved or replaced. What remains is only the account, incomplete, contested in its details, preserved mainly because the people who were nearby understood, even at the time, that something worth preserving had briefly occupied that space. 2 performers, 1 room, half an hour, perhaps less, and the particular quiet weight of being understood by someone who cost you nothing to impress, because they had already seen, from the outside, exactly what you were.